Hello, I'm Alexandra Wenman, and today I'm very excited to be speaking with one of the world's leading experts on near-death experiences, Dr. Raymond Moody. Hello, Raymond. Nice to see you.
Hello, thank you so much for having me on this program. This is really nice, thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure to be speaking with you. I just wanted to start off really just giving our viewers and our readers a little bit of a background about yourself and how you came to be a leading expert on such an interesting topic. Can you start off like just letting us know a little bit about maybe your childhood and growing up, and if you had an interest in this sort of thing from a young age?
Well, I grew up in a really tiny town in Georgia, a town of 2,000 people, and my whole outlook was sort of shaped by that place, where I like a very placid life. And as a kid, I really just kind of like sitting around on the porch and rocking chairs and talking and reading lots and lots of books. And so I'm still just very rural in my outlook. And so at about age 7, I became fascinated with astronomy, which is still actually it's one of my very favorite subjects, has been since I was 7 or 8.
Amazing.
And I also wanted to be a comedian when I was a child.
Really?
And
Well, those two go hand in
yeah,
hand quite well.
and I got to do it a little later too. I was a semi-professional comedian for a while. But so that's how it was for me, just a very small town existence, and from very early childhood interested in astronomy and fascinated even as a kid by humor and what makes people laugh.
Fantastic. God, that's interesting. I never knew that about you. That's very interesting. And incredible. I just as an aside, can I ask you, do you find that just talking about the topic of near-death experiences and the afterlife, what's
Mhm.
your kind of take on how we sort of treat death in the Western world, given that you're, somebody who loves laughter and loves obviously to celebrate life? Do you feel that we could celebrate the afterlife a little bit more, or how do you feel about the way we handle the funeral arrangements these days?
Actually, I don't have much of an opinion about it at all. In that, what I see is the vast sweep of it. I mean, for example, even in the idea of fearing death, that is such a complex idea. I mean, many people at some time fear death, but there's always a little difference. Like some people fear the physical pain they imagine that might go along with it. Some people fear separation from their loved ones. Some people fear the idea of obliteration or non-existence. Some people fear hell, or so it's just such a vast thing. And similarly, I guess maybe I don't get to see a normal sample of the population, but the people who come to me in my profession usually have some situation where they've had to confront the whole idea of death and are working with it. So I don't know. I think people are highly variable
Okay.
in the way they think about death.
Yeah. Yeah. You must get to see quite a good mix actually. So when did you first become interested in the afterlife? Was it in your youth, or how did it come about?
Not at all. I was not a religious person. My dad was, the way I put it together now, because that World War II generation didn't talk, as you know, but my father must have had some gosh awful experiences as a medic in World War II in the Pacific Theater. But at any rate, he just always dismissed religion. And I had a grandmother who was very not religious, and she was kind of humorous about it. Not in a mocking way, but just kind of gently humorous about religious people. So I grew up with those attitudes. I remember deciding very early in my life that death was just the obliteration of the body and the vanishing of consciousness. And that's pretty much what I always assumed. And then when I was 18 years old, I went to the University of Virginia with the idea of getting my PhD in astronomy ultimately. But when I got there, I had been interested in philosophy in high school. And so when I got to UVA, I took a philosophy course my first semester, and literally just in the first couple of days of that class, reading Plato's Republic, I was hooked. Wow, and Plato is still really my favorite writer. I mean, I always ask people, my students, for example, I say, well, why do you think this guy has been in print continually for 2,300 years? It's powerful stuff. And the Republic is really about the afterlife. It's the whole thing is structured and around near-death experiences and other ways that they had of, in their minds, going to the next world. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that Plato took it seriously and that he offered these very persuasive arguments that it's the most important question. So that woke me up to it. The fact that Plato would take it seriously made me think, well, maybe there's something I'm missing. And I knew about near-death experiences as an undergraduate philosophy student because, believe it or not, the early Greek philosophers, one of their standard activities was to collect these stories of what they called the revenants, or we would say today, people with near-death experiences, people who were believed to have died and come back, which happened in antiquity as now recent, obviously. In the past few decades, the advent of CPR has enabled us to have a lot more people like that.
I was going to say, has it increased because of that? It must be.
Yeah, but even in antiquity, people knew about this, and there were books about it, and the same argument about it then as people have now. Democritus and the atomists said, oh, it's just the brain acting up as the body disintegrates. But then Plato and that kind of attitude took these things seriously. Plato very solemnly sort of pronounced that this near-death experience that he recounts was the real thing. So that's how I came upon it. Then in 1965, I was a third-year student at the University of Virginia, and I heard from one of my philosophy professors that a psychiatry professor there at the university, Dr. George Ritchie, had actually been pronounced dead some years before. So, and George was just very open to talking with students. So pretty soon I was in a little group of people he told this story to, and he was very impressive. I mean, just the finest person I ever knew, really. So that's where I began with this, and since that time I've talked with literally thousands of people from all over the world who had these extraordinary events in their lives.
Wowzers. And would you say you have had any kind of, brush with death yourself, or I suppose?
I've come close to death once or twice, but and I did experience a dramatic alteration in consciousness. I did, and but I think I wasn't close, and I didn't have what people interpret to be a near-death experience and seeing my body or a light or anything. But I did get to that point where I could tell something was about to happen. It's as though that realm of consciousness that I was in was beginning to surrender its links to the physical world. I mean, it was definitely something was happening. But again, people say they have no way of describing it, and that's, yeah.
Did it feel like an expansion of sorts, or I guess you've just said you can't really put it into words, haven't you?
Expansion. Well, yes. In the sense that you realize that reality is layered, or that apparently this thing we're in here, whatever we want to call it, is enfolded within some, more complex order of reality. Is the only way I could, sense what I, and so then the question arises, then what is it like to experience a change of dimension? And I'm beginning to think that's what people with near-death experiences are experiencing.
So almost like, I suppose some people probably look at our lives here on, on planet Earth and in the 3D as almost being like, I suppose, a kind of avatar possibly, potentially, and then maybe when we die, the veil kind of lifts and you can suddenly see through all the dimensions and you can see the bigger reality and the bigger picture.
That's a very good description of what the most, the people that I've talked with over the years who had the most involved and complex near-death experiences and had, and who were physiologically speaking and medically speaking the closest of all to death. People who really there's no accounting medically for how they lived. And so in those cases, you do see this, seeing the multiple levels of reality seems to go along with that. Yeah.
Have you ever had...
You were talking...
Sorry, go on.
You were talking about the avatar concept. Yeah, philosophically, the question of life after death and these near-death experiences and so on, what it relates to as a philosophical question is the question of personal identity. What is it about us that constitutes the individual personal self? And there have been various kinds of answers about this through the philosophical tradition. The way it got started in the West probably was with a man named Hermotimus about 600 BCE, who was mentioned, I think, by Plato and Aristotle, and I think Xenophanes and the other early Greek philosophers. But he had mastered the art of out-of-body travel, or claimed to be able
like astral travel.
Yes, and so apparently, that was a big kind of thing for people to realize. That they begin to realize, well, there's two things here. There's the body, but then there's some other thing. And Plato called it the soul, and he said, well, what we really are is this immaterial entity, the soul, which somehow inhabits the body. And, that sounds pretty interesting, but, what does it really mean? How do you tell? I mean, it's just all kinds of big questions about that. Then, the soul concept prevailed during the Middle Ages. Then, when you get up to Locke in the 17th century, for example, John Locke said, well, what constitutes us is our memories. It's the stream of your memories. And then Hume came along, in the next century and said, balderdash, that as he looks into his consciousness and he tries hard to catch that substrate of the thing that's, the permanent there, he says never can do it. That whenever he looks inside and introspects, there's always just some particular thought or idea rather than some, thing underlying them. And so, it's philosophically the question of personal identity is just, who knows? What is it that survives death? That's a big question. And as close as I can get to it, and this is something I've come to in the last couple of years, is that I think it's all about narratives. And, you know, what is a human life but a story, right? So a person is a kind of life story. And I think of this dimension we're in as a vast educational and entertainment medium. Now, that may sound utterly psychotic, but, you know, Elie Wiesel said, God made man because he, capital H-E, loves stories. God made man because he loves stories. And I think there's something to that. You know, the older people get, I've noticed, the more effect there is as they look back on their life. They develop the almost uncanny sense that it had been like a script or a drama. I heard Joseph Campbell say that. And when I did some geriatric psychiatry with, and some of the people I saw would be, you know, okay, not Alzheimer's or anything, but just situational stress or whatever. And I heard that a lot from older people who were insightful, that the older they got, the more this impression of the dramatic nature of their life story had been. And I'm beginning to think that some people might look at that and say, well, it's just a metaphor, right? You're taking the human institution of decay, or of the stage, and you're putting out there as the metaphor for the whole thing.
Wasn't it Shakespeare that said all the world's a stage?
All the world's a stage,
all the world's
absolutely.
A stage. Yeah.
And I think it's probably that, I think it's the other way around. I think that what happened was that people like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides kind of probably realized that feature of life, that as you get older, it has that structure. And then they just came up with the idea, oh, well, you know, a play is just a life with the boring parts taken out, really. So I think, you know, this idea of, I think that's probably the best analogy I can come up with. The structure of this world is that we're living through these stories, in effect, or just searching out different ways of learning or being or whatever, for some purpose that we can't divine.
That's so interesting. And what would you say in all of your years of research, because obviously you've been researching this topic for quite some time now, and you've got something like, is it 12 books out around this topic? Amazing. What would you say is the most profound discovery about this topic for you personally that you've learned?
Well, first of all, I want to preface this by saying that to me, bragging is a very ugly behavior, number one. And number two, I'm sick of Raymond Moody, you know. See what I mean? When you're 69,
bless you, Raymond.
You're just finished with yourself, you know. But nonetheless, and I'm saying this not as a divine pronouncement, but rather as a sort of challenge, is that I do think that I have discovered two entirely new ways of investigating the afterlife question that are not pseudoscientific. I'm not a parapsychologist, and I think that's pseudoscience to say that scientific method is going to give you the answer to the afterlife question. But nonetheless, I think there's ways of doing it rigorously. And that, in effect, the idea is that we can equip people with new principles of logical thinking, then when it just so happens by chance that later on they have a near-death experience, then having these new principles will enable them and sort of push them, actually, to formulate the experience in some new way that's very different from what people say now when they've only looked at the experience through the lens of a sort of strictly Aristotelian logic. And that's a very complicated thing to say, but basically that's the principle. I think we can actually prepare the human mind to receive better and to articulate better near-death experiences.
And that's very important because, as we've already, spoken about, a lot of people fear death. And if they can look at it from a new perspective, it might help people as they're preparing to pass.
Yeah. I think one thing we can say pretty clearly is that people with near-death experiences come back and that they don't fear death. That's absolutely right. And that says something because, by and large, the people I've talked with over the years are of good judgment, and the fact that so many of them have this conviction that, as illogical as it might say.
And Raymond, what would you say is your take on topics such as past life experiences?
Well, not being parapsychologically minded, I'm not into that social orbit. To tell you the truth, I don't really respect seems to me that a lot of not so critical thinking is behind some of the books that have been written on that. So I don't take that part of it very seriously. And yet, in my family, just in the past few years, Cheryl and I have had a couple of things with our 2 adopted children that really, to me, this is great food for thought because both of them were adopted at birth, but both have related very vivid memories about what they were doing before they came here.
Wow.
And how they chose to come to us now. And I understand perfectly that somebody just hearing my words in a void would say, aha, this man talks about life after death all the time. Well, and I can understand somebody with that attitude, but the reality is we don't go to church. We don't talk about life after death. My wife and I, we talk about how to pay the telephone bill. What's for dinner? What's the movies this week? And I don't talk to my kids about this stuff. It's something I do in my profession. Okay? And so, and like I said, we don't go to any religious services and so on. And so, both of these kids just related very detailed things about their memories of coming here. And it's my 15-year-old son just in the past couple of months sort of took me aside again and reminded me of it. And this is very impressive. And so and even David Hume said, the grandfather of all the modern skeptics, said that really he kind of thought that this idea of rebirth or reincarnation was the only kind of idea about an afterlife that a really rational person could entertain. And so I am sympathetic to the idea of reincarnation. I think one little glitch about it, though, is that I think that it's very hard for me to imagine how it could, how or why it should be set up on a time scale. That is, why would people have to say, well, in 3000 BC I had a past life in Mesopotamia, then it's up to 1500 and I'm, in Northern Europe, and then 700 BC I'm down in Rome, and put it together like that.
Yeah.
When people who have near-death experiences tell me that in their near-death experience, time dissolves. They say that really, from that other state of existence, there's no such thing as time.
Yeah.
So it's a bit implausible to me that it would have to be arranged on a time scale.
Which
But
leads me,
nonetheless,
which leads nicely to my next question, which is about parallel lives. So it's interesting, isn't it? So if we're living, say, you know, time dissolves after this life ends, we're living, then you're in a multi-dimensional, I guess, pool of potential lifetimes, aren't you? You could be living millions at once, potentially.
Yeah, we're always looking for analogies. And, you know, the whole information, electronic information system provides an interesting analogy that when you think of the difference that's taken place in about the last 60 years, we're going from the radio age to what we have now.
I know.
Well, you know, it's maybe a similar transition that compared to what we have here, that other dimension or state of existence is something really just beyond our powers to imagine or describe. It's always been described in terms of the information technology. Even in Plato's Republic, there's the guy who had the near-death experiences trying to describe to his friends the experience he had, and he said in one place he went, he said that it was as though everything he had ever done was inscribed in a wax tablet on his chest. Well, that was the information of technology of that time, was a wax tablet. Nowadays, people are, you know, more likely to talk about holograms and so on, but it's all within the context that apparently it's beyond outside of the range of language to describe.
Amazing. And what seems to be the most common theme, or the most important message, I suppose, that people bring back from NDEs, from near-death experiences, in your opinion?
Well, the first thing is that no matter what they were chasing, whether it was knowledge, like me, or fame or power or money or any of these things, when people come back from this, they say what they found out this was all about, or seems to have to do with, is love and learning to love. So they come back inspired to do that. Incidentally, they also recount frustration at being unable to put it into practice, ideally. That, you know, as my friend George Ritchie said to me one time, he said, Raymond, you know, he said, this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden, by which he meant he was a kind-hearted person and wouldn't say. What I'm about to say to describe it would be that it's very hard to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person, right? And this doesn't make it any better, but nonetheless, the inspiration to learn to love. Secondly, there's no more fear of death. They say that, you know, they're convinced that death is just a transition into some other reality. And a third thing I hear from people is that it motivates them to want to study and to learn. Yeah. Some people say that they get the impression very strongly that even after you die, this process of learning goes on.
So it's a continual, like we're in a big classroom pretty much, I suppose.
Yes.
Wowzers. And what's your take on fate? Do you believe in fate? Do you believe our parts of our lives and therefore our deaths can be preordained? So maybe these people that are, you know, having near-death experiences, maybe it's not their time and, you know, they're being brought back, or they're having to come back to actually live out the rest of their time.
Well, I tell you, I'm going to have to get my Ouija board out.
We are doing this.
I don't know. You know, I sort of give up. That's, you know, being a philosophy major kind of ruins you for practical life. But I think, the fate one, that's kind of beyond my pay scale. I do have a sense, though. You see, this idea of an afterlife has been a hard sell for me. It's when you don't have it when you're a child, you don't really have much of a basis to, and so it seems sort of contradictory to me, right, to say life after death. So, I'll tell you the truth. Logic and philosophy of language and ancient Greek philosophy were the fields from which my interest about this near-death experience emerged. See, I was studying them even long before I went to medical school. So it's really a philosophical background. And so I realize all the difficulties in making inferences to the idea of an afterlife from things like these, experiences like these. And so I just didn't know. I mean, people wanted me to talk more about this, and so I kept writing books and so on. However, about a little over a year ago, I had something happen that just, in a sense, it made me realize that I had reached the point where I had run out of things to use to escape from the idea that there's an afterlife. And let me explain. I was out west about, say, 3 years ago and gave a lecture on near-death experiences, and this very nice man came up afterward. He was obviously, the fine arts type of person, the way they look, and, that nice affect. And he was an artist, and he was a very good graphic artist. And, I guess having the artist's problem of how you make a living, actually started a very successful and wonderful advertising agency so he can use his art. And he had been in this horrific car crash. And I've seen the medical part of this. It's really impossible for me to understand how he could have lived with those injuries. And in the accident, he lost both of his legs, and his wife was killed instantly. And, many people who have this kind of thing, they don't really tell their doctors about it. I mean, it's not, often they don't. And so he was telling me about this profound experience he had when his heart stopped beating and so on. And so I said, well, you really should write this up. And my thinking was, for publication or not, who knows? But I was just thinking in terms of his process, being an artist, it seemed like a good thing for him to write it up. So he did, and he, about in August of last year, he sent me the manuscript, which I read. It was great, and I wrote a little foreword for it. Then in September of last year, he sent me the finished book, because having a graphic arts company, I guess, is a way to print books. So then a few days later, about 2 weeks later, he called me back. And he said that when he was reading his own book, he had realized that he had seen that he had mentioned the name of the trauma surgeon who saved his life. And it was a very eminent trauma surgeon, by the way. And that he was thinking that, since he hadn't told the doctor about it, not that there's anything wrong with it, but if by any chance that doctor were to see that book and to see his own name in it, this man just thought it was kind of impolite. Mm. So he called the doctor and invited him to lunch. And when the trauma surgeon came to lunch, he told him the story of his experience. Whereupon the trauma surgeon became very serious and solemn and said, well, I've never told anybody this, but that night you came into the hospital, I knew you weren't going to die because the operating room opened out into another dimension, and I talked with your wife, who had been killed in the accident. And at that point, that's just a very hard thing to put together without bringing in the notion of something beyond this.
Yeah.
You can be cantankerous and say, well, sure, simultaneously when the patient was having a near-death experience because of the oxygen cut off, the famed neurosurgeon was having an hysterical episode or whatever, you would say. But I just think it's, at a certain point, it just becomes more straightforward to say, wow, there really is something here. Yeah.
And talking about the different souls who, I guess, talking about the fact that his wife was there and that the doctor could chat to the wife, and talking about also you talking about your kids having, past life experiences and saying they've come back to be with you. What's your take on like the idea of kind of soul groups and the fact that certain people are actually meant to live together and work together as part of like a learning experience?
Again, I don't know. I just don't know. I understand how, yes, you see things in life that make you wonder about things like that, like what, but I don't know. I don't know. I've certainly had things in my life that make me wonder, but I don't know whether I have any way of
finding it out. Yeah. And I guess, what are your thoughts on things? There's loads of different healing and therapy techniques around in the world today, and ways of, I guess, tapping into the subconscious mind. And I guess if people can have these near-death experiences through, actually having a near-death experience, do you think people could potentially tap into a similar kind of, I guess, for want of a better word, life lesson through something such as clinical hypnosis? Because there's people out there doing past life regression therapy. And, you talk about people having a near-death experience, bringing back this profound sense of love. Do you think that's something that could be perhaps simulated in a hypnotherapy scenario or something such as that?
I don't know. I think there are so many different kinds of ways of opening up your, I just don't know. I don't know. At one time years ago, back in the 70s, when there's a medical student and psychiatry resident, I was learning hypnosis. And because once in a while I had people I talked with who almost died who told me that they couldn't remember all of the details of their near-death experiences, that they feel that there were parts that they had a sense that something else went on, but they couldn't bring it to consciousness. So I flirted with the idea of hypnosis back to the time of the near-death experience, but then I immediately thought about the fact that you can, for example, raise a welt on some people's arm or area of redness just by giving them the suggestion when they're in a deep trance that they're having something to burn their skin. And so I thought, well, what if I precipitated a cardiac arrest? And so I thought I better not do that. And then a few years later, I mentioned to my friend George Ritchie, the psychiatrist, that I had been through that process, and he laughed and he said, well, I'm glad you thought of it, because that some of his psychiatry friends had tried that stunt when he was a resident, and they took him back to the time of the cardiac arrest and began to get neck vein distension, signs of heart failure. So, yeah, there are.
It's frightening.
But I think there are plenty of of ways to open up your conscious awareness. I think to these other kinds of reality.
And you've talked about shared death experience as well, haven't you? Is that something that well, first of all, can you tell us what that is?
Yes, well, all of the kinds of elements that we think of as making up a near-death experience. For example, the experience of leaving one's body, or coming aware of this passageway and going toward a light and seeing apparitions of one's deceased loved ones, and even including seeing a panoramic review of your life. All of those things also quite often take place not to someone who almost dies and is brought back, but rather to people who are standing around as some other person actually does die. And I call those shared death experiences because the experience or the perception of the bystanders is that they empathically co-live part of the person who dying experience. And for example, bystanders may say that they see something leave the body, often described as a sort of transparent, almost like a replica of the person. Or bystanders may themselves say that they leave their bodies and go part way toward this light with their relative who dies. And people say that they may see the spirits of the dying person's dead relatives or friends sort of coming into the scene. And the room may fill with light, or people may hear beautiful music, up to and including, incredibly, cases where the bystander actually co-lives the dying life review of the person who dies.
So literally
now that
sees
to me is just shocking,
life flash before their eyes. My gosh,
embarrassing as it may be.
Wow.
I am not even looking forward to sitting in on my own life review, much less having some, spectator there. But yet people who tell me this say that it's not as you might imagine, that it's actually completely natural within that context. So the significance of this, is that if as we are told by some people, that these experiences are just the artifact of the dying brain, the oxygen cut off of oxygen flow to the brain, bringing about a electrochemical discharge in the brain. Well, why then would the bystanders who are not ill or injured, who don't have cut off of the oxygen flow to the brain, why would they have the same experience?
That takes that whole idea out of the equation,
I think it does. I think it does. The people who make this objection, in my opinion, are not very well informed, in the sense that by and large they don't actually talk to patients. They just read other people's books and make these pronouncements. And I can see how it's possible. I mean, superficially, for example, a person with temporal lobe or partial complex epilepsy will describe things to you that are maybe somehow analogous to what we hear with people with near-death experiences. But I worked as a psychiatrist in a unit for some time for epileptics, and I've talked with people with temporal lobe epilepsy. I've talked with people with near-death experiences. I've talked with people who had both near-death experiences and temporal lobe epilepsy. And the descriptions are not alike, and people who've had both will tell you that it's something very different. Yeah, so you know, it's you can think of all the plausible, upfront, or I think it's superficial objections, but I, I don't know any simple way of just erasing these near-death experiences from the agenda. I think this is it's something that's just gonna keep on happening, and it's getting more pronounced because we're bringing people back from closer and closer approaches to death. Right? I started medical school in '72. Well, that was 41 years ago, and in that period of time, the medical progress has been immense, and people now are regularly rescued, from illnesses and injuries that when I was a medical student, it couldn't have been that they would have lived. And so even when they come back from these extreme physiological states, they still keep talking about these experiences. And the experiences are getting correspondingly more complex. Mm. It seems that the longer a person's cardiac arrest, the deeper they get into this experience.
So the more vivid the experience and the more kind of detailed, I suppose, it is.
That's right. As a general rule at first, which is the opposite of what you would think if it really does have to do with the brain winding down.
Yeah, because the brain would be dying, surely, and then it wouldn't be. It would be less detailed. That's incredible. That's really interesting. And with your talk about shared death experiences, I think I read somewhere that you have had a shared death experience. Is that true?
I did, and it was the funniest thing. I had been hearing about these shared death experiences originally first when one of my own professors in medical school in 1972 told me her own shared death experience. And then I just sort of kept on collecting them over the years. I published something about it in 1994. And then I was going to do an investigation of it, and I went out to the city in the West in 1994, and we were organizing to see how to study this. And that happened to be Mother's Day of 1994, and I called my mom and wished her happy Mother's Day. Found out that she had had a rash the day before. Went to the doctor, was not thought to be anything significant. So that's how the status was on that Mother's Day. The next day she went to the doctor, and who examined and who told her that she had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and had 2 days to 2 weeks to live. And so 2 weeks later to the day she did die, and my wife and I had been there at the bedside this whole 2 weeks. And when she died, my wife and I and my brother-in-law and my sister had this shared death experience. So what that did to me paradoxically, I am driven so much by curiosity. At that point, I just sort of stopped investigating, or I just wasn't interested in writing about it because I guess I was maybe processing or integrating my own experience. So finally, then the publisher came back, a couple of years ago, and asked me to write it. So that I did write that up. There's Glimpses of Eternity is the name of that book. But this is something again that anybody who has access to terminally ill patients and their families will be able to discover that this is just a very common thing that the bystanders at bedside experience quite profound spiritual events during that process.
And in all your years of hearing about people's shared death experiences and near-death experiences, has anyone ever come back with a negative experience?
Yes. I don't know much of what to say about negative experiences because they are relatively few, and therefore it makes it more difficult to get a fix on them. When the Gallup survey did a study of near-death experiences in about 1979, I think that they found that about 3% of them, or it might have been 0.3%, but anyway, it was a very small percentage, had negative experiences. Secondly, negative experiences tend to be less homogeneous. That is, the positive near-death experiences seem to cluster around common features, whereas the negative ones are just spread out all over
really
the
different.
place. And it reminds me of that old saying we have in psychiatry that every happy family is the same, but every, disturbed family has its own particular, kind of craziness. And so for that reason, it's hard to study them. And another possible conflicting, difficulty here is that it might be, I can easily imagine that negative near-death experiences might be underreported. Personally, I would probably have a harder time saying to the doctor, Doc, when I died, I went to hell.
Yeah, yeah.
Keep that to myself.
I might not want to admit that.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, it's just different. Sometimes people describe what they call negative near-death experiences that seem to be like what I would call a delirium. And delirious patients, and will talk about all these very vivid and sort of surrealistically distorted visions, and that I think that somehow those sometimes leak in and get called negative near-death experiences.
And it could be like they're getting confused with their experience potentially.
Yeah. So, but I really don't know.
Yeah. And is there statistically, has there been sort of a higher percentage of these experiences in certain parts of the world? I mean, I guess with modern medicine, does the West have a higher percentage than the rest of the world, or?
I don't know. I don't know. Just offhand, I would say that there probably is a higher rate of them in countries where cardiopulmonary resuscitation technology is everywhere, right? Because in a place where there is no medical care, people are, I'm sure, much more likely to die from close call death. So that would be one factor. But one thing I might say about that is, in the past, anthropologists have found various cultures who, like the Greeks, liked to hang on to these stories and tell and retell them. And one such group, for example, was the Salto Indians of Canada. And in the 1930s, a man named David Hollowell, an anthropologist, studied them, and he found that they had a sort of tradition that when somebody came close to death in the tribe, they would talk to them and get their story, and they passed these along in the oral tradition. So, I think, who knows though whether there is one place where people are more likely to report it.
And have you had many experiences of people sort of talking about other beings or other people being present in their near-death experience? Have you had people talk about, say, like angelic presences or, beings that seem to be from other dimensions?
Well, yes, in the sense that people talk about this being of complete compassion and love and light, which they put various identifications on. Jews tend to say God or an angel. Christians say Christ or whatever. I've heard different. Some people say just this loving light, this person of light. But other than that, I can't really think of anything like that. Nope. People say that there are these enlightened presences who, seem to be sentient entities, but seem to be more composed of love or light.
Wow. And do you think that's sort of, I guess, the main thing that we can learn from these experiences is more about love and more about how to...
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. However, I'm not so sure how much that will affect human behavior. I just wonder about that. Sometimes I've been contacted back, for example, in the 70s, this very wonderful man who had a lot of money and who was just a renowned businessman and aircraft factory owner. Was really hoping to try to use this information to prove life after death. And, he thought, well, if you can just make this, give a scientific proof of an afterlife, then everything would be okay. People would start loving each other and so on. And I said, well, I didn't know if that would happen or not. Number one, I said, well, I couldn't really help it because scientifically, science, at least in this period of history, is not the appropriate means of investigation for this. There's nothing there scientifically to test. There's no way you could find an observation that would counter the claim that there is life after death. As Popper would say, you can't think of a falsifying observation. So it's not something you could figure out with science.
It's like that film, Flatliners, isn't it? You could, what are you going to do?
Well,
put people out deliberately and go, right, come and report back. It's not really something you can do.
Exactly. So, but I think there are other ways of doing it.
Is there anything in all your years of research that you feel is a major question for you that remains unanswered? What's the one thing you wish you could have proof on?
Well, it's not really about near-death experiences or the afterlife question. What I would really like to know is, let's put it this way. I can't really imagine that we are the only, human beings are the only sentient, intelligent creatures in the universe. Like I said, I keep up with astronomy, and I recently read the most recent and most accurate count of the estimated number of stars in the known universe is 150 billion trillion. Now, the Kepler is showing us that lots and lots of stars have planets. But let's just assume, to be very conservative, that the solar system we're in is an exception in that it has many more planets than the average. The likelihood is that we're in the middle of the bell curve, but let's just assume that we're far over on the right on the number of planets that we have, and that we have 8, but that the average system has only 4. Okay? So you multiply 4 by 150, that's 600 billion trillion stars. And the latest estimates is that estimates say that about 1 out of 1,000 planets apparently is Earth-like. So that's a big enough number for me to just figure they're out there.
Yeah. And
what I would really like to have is I'd like to know a couple, just one of them would even be great. I mean, just to find out about one other, civilization of sentient entities out there would be, that just, and I know that's kind of maybe unrealistic. It's a lot more realistic now than it was when I was a kid because of the technology available. And incidentally, I'm not into UFOs. It's like as an amateur astronomer, I've seen so many UFOs, I couldn't possibly believe them. And, what I mean is that you just see all kinds of things.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think they're here yet. But I really would like to know about an extraterrestrial civilization.
Well, there are people that talk about, because don't they say that the light of a star can take billions of years to reach Earth, and then by the time that light reaches Earth, then that star could have died.
That's right.
So perhaps there are planets that have kind of passed over, and there is civilization, but they're in another dimension potentially.
What an interesting question, and I've wondered about that too. I mean, in 2013, we think of the question of, is there life after death, and is there life on other worlds in outer space? We think of those as two distinct questions. But it hasn't always been so, and if you went back even to the early 19th century, the late 18th century, you would see that people tended to collapse those questions. And what was happening at that time, Kant had realized that when you see the Milky Way, what that is it's looking through the rim sort of the galaxy, and that he had, at that time, they were seeing these smudges through their telescopes that were sort of at the limits of their resolution. They couldn't make out what they were, but Kant correctly surmised that those were other galaxies out there, as we now know them to be. And so then the question got to be, well, what does the Bible say about this? Or, like, how do you fit that into the Bible? And so in Britain, there was this great guy. I forgot his first name. His last name was Chalmers. And he was at Oxford or Cambridge. And just a very good scholar of astronomy, but also had some theological interest. And he wrote this series of books that were really big in Britain and America on his theological. See, they were trying to figure out, well, since there are all these other planets, what does God have in mind for them? Since obviously we're the center of things. And so Chalmers decided to solve it by saying, well, those other planets are the abode of our own departed relatives, that they've gone out there to.
It's another near-death experience.
Just to think back 200 years and that our ancestors, really took that seriously. I mean, it was just a very popular point of view. And so, it's the question of afterlife, intelligence on other worlds is now solvable. We can imagine ways that we would really, get some information that would inform us.
Yeah, well, there's the crop circles and all sorts. They think that could be messages from extraterrestrials, don't they?
Well, yeah, some people think that. I put very little, credence in that sort of thing, because I know I was a teenager myself once, and I know about pranks and so on. So, but it's, I guess it shows that if they are making the crop circles, then the aliens are crazy too, just like we. So we can get along with them then.
Exactly. Well, they're certainly creative. In terms of life after death, what's your take on sort of people who say they're psychic, or they have mediumship abilities and are able to communicate with people on the other side?
Well, I'm of two thoughts. One thought is that I've seen things in my life with people I know that really I see something happen. For 20 years, we've had an assistant, Linda, who is a very, very grounded and honest person who just has, Linda is the most honest person I know, and forthright, and a worker, and so on. And several times over the years, she's had experiences that make me, or said things that make me see, yeah, she has sometimes spontaneously these episodes where she, I guess, experiences some sort of opening of fabric, or I don't know what it is, some sort of contact. Mm. So that much, yeah, okay. The question that goes further than that to say about the people on TV and the stage, I have really just no idea. I think, first of all, I can see ways of talking. I don't accept this criterion. People are impressed by, the medium told me things they couldn't possibly have known. Well, as a clinician, I think that most people have a very, very bad judgment about what somebody else couldn't possibly have known about them. Mm. Number one, that's a very confusing question, first of all. Yeah. And secondly, I see that what the stage mediums work with something called prosopopoeia, which is a figure of speech that Aristotle pointed out gives you an almost hallucinatory feeling of vivid reality to it. Like, it's basically speaking, using to speak of a dead person in the present tense is prosopopoeia, and it gives this incredible vivid experience. And that's what you see mediums do. And then there's another thing that's studied by psychologists that's called the Barnum effect, where people take very diffuse information and general information and apply it uniquely to themselves. So, I just have no opinion about mediums because I can see ways where, I could see how that can be done.
You can get around it. Yeah.
Yeah, without any supernatural thing happening. But I still, the ultimate answer is I don't know.
Mm. Yeah. Mm. And I suppose there's not really any way we can tell this either, but do you think that animals have past life near-death experiences as well?
Near-death experiences. A woman once told me she thought her dog did. And the woman was of sufficient gravity. And just a minute, Mom. This says plug in the computer immediately. It's telling me that it's running out of power, but
oh no,
she's coming over.
Technical glitches tonight. The computer's having a near-death experience.
Yeah, but I don't know, and it really seems kind of unfair to deny other animals one, right? I mean, if people can have an afterlife, why not whales, really? Or,
yeah.
Then you get into the question of how far down does it go? I mean, an amoeba might have, that seems bizarre, but it seems bizarre at the same time to deny an afterlife to whales if you're going to say that people have one. So, obviously, this is unknowable things, but they're fun to think about.
Fundamental, yeah. And it's often said, or it's often reported, that just before a person dies, say that a person's been ill for some time, or they may have been quite debilitated, but there's a lot of cases where people seem to come back to full health momentarily just before they pass over.
Yes.
And it can seem as though they're actually going to pull through. Why do you think this happens? Do you have any kind of knowledge to that effect?
Well, I have seen that so many times, both in my medical career and also with my own family members who passed away, that absolutely it does happen. And it even has a name. The name is F-E-Y. And if you look up that word Fae in the dictionary, it has a host of meanings. But the central one that it seems to rotate about is that Fae is an apparently heightened state of awareness that portends imminent death. And just as you say, it's people can be obtunded, they're not responsive for long periods of time. All the relatives say that, they're just waiting around for the heart to stop. When all of a sudden grandma comes back to vibrant existence. If you've seen this, you know what I mean when I say that they look more alive than alive. They really do. It's like they have this glow on their face. It's like all of their neuroses have dropped away. They may give a very coherent message to everybody present, and then they just turn over and die. And people say, well, the adrenaline flood or whatever. And I say, maybe, but, what a ridiculous thing to have to fall back on, because actually it's, I think it's just an incredible thing to see. I've seen a lot of patients have adrenaline surges in various circumstances, but I've never seen anybody light up like that from an adrenaline surge. I just don't know what it is, but they definitely give you the feeling that they are sort of halfway here and halfway on the other side.
It almost seems like a foot between two worlds, doesn't it?
It really does. It does.
It's so interesting. Gosh.
Remarkable to see it. Sometimes, too, people in the last days or hours or moments of life will start reciting poetry, or sometimes even making up poetry on the spot, or even singing songs. And Plato observed this too in his Phaedo dialogue, where Socrates, who had always sort of disavowed and disdained music and song and such, on the day of his execution was writing songs in prison. And when his friends kind of called him on this, kind of suspecting it might have meant that he was slipping under this, strain, he said, no, he said, I'm doing this in obedience to dreams and visions that tell me to pursue music. And music to the Greeks, it was song and poetry. It was the same word. But, and then he goes on to analogize himself or compare himself to the swans, because the Greeks had a folk belief that just before swans die, they sing the most beautiful songs of all. So,
yeah, that is said. Yeah.
So then I learned about that in Plato, and then a few years later in medical school saw it myself with patients. It really does happen. It's not as common as near-death experiences or shared death experiences, but anybody who works around the terminally ill for a long period of time will have examples of that.
Yeah. Yeah, my dad's a doctor and he talks about it quite often. Yeah. And just for people watching, you're actually coming over to London.
I am. Oh boy, I can't wait. I just love London.
I'm sure London loves you as well. It's very exciting that you're coming. When was the last time you were over here?
That was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but I have so many wonderful memories of London. London was the first city I went to outside of the United States in late June of 1969.
Wow.
And I remember the antiquarian bookstores and Indian restaurants, and oh my God, and going to Hyde Park Counter. To Hyde Park Corner, the Speaker's Corner. Oh my God!
That's so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. And in those days, these days it's gotten a little more political or something.
Mm.
Back then it was more sort of just eccentric people.
Yeah.
And, you know, rather than like some sort of political.
Huge big debates that go on there now. It's. So what can people, if people want to come and book on your workshop, what can people hope to experience from the workshop that you'll be teaching in London?
Well, I'm going to just, first of all, I have a program with things to talk about, but what I'm looking forward to is actually to have the interaction with people. So I want to allow a lot of time for questions and discussion. But the things I'm going to talk about specifically are like near-death experiences and shared death experiences, and also my work with the psychomanteon. You know, the ancient Greeks had underground facilities they called psychomanteons, or oracles of the dead, where they had various techniques whereby they could actually enable people to have full color, moving, three-dimensional encounters with the spirits of supposedly of the deceased. And basically, I figured out how to do this. We wouldn't be able to do it in the course of the workshop because it takes a whole day on a one-on-one basis, but I absolutely can acquaint people with simple ways of how to do this for themselves. It's you know, it was something that our great-grandparents knew about very well, but it's when the radio age and subsequently the TV age came in, people stopped doing this sort of thing. But it's a very well-known method that even goes back to antiquity, whereby people can have really vivid, lifelike encounters when they're fully awake with such what seem to be the spirits of your dead relatives. Yeah, it really does work. It's as crazy as it sounds. I taught this method about 17 years ago to a bunch of psychotherapists at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology near San Francisco, and now they've published numerous replications of it, and they also they teach it to their PhD students in psychotherapy. It's beginning to be recognized as a viable method to help people through the grieving process.
Incredible. That's amazing that you can do that. That's fantastic. And what's the
and
one...
then also,
Sorry, what were you going to say?
Also, I'm going to talk about entirely new ways of investigating the afterlife question. I think that we're on the road to real, rational enlightenment on this.
That is brilliant, Raymond. How exciting! Well, I'm going to be there, and I can't wait. And I'm bringing a good friend of mine as well.
Good.
And there's just one final question before I actually let you go. And what do you believe? What's your personal belief? In your personal belief, is the real purpose of life here on Earth?
You know, this may sound flippant, but it's what I really sense is that this is about learning and about also drama and entertainment. It's ways of God made man because he loves stories. I think there's something to that, and that this is a narrative existence we live. That one thing that distinguishes human beings, I think, from all other species that we know of, is that we relate a story of ourselves or narrate a story of ourselves as we go along. And I think that we get other trips through it. That there's a frame of reference from which you can select any number of these, just almost like selecting from your DVD collection what to watch tonight.
It certainly would it would make people, I think, a lot happier with their lives if they could take that perspective and just see it as fun, as play, wouldn't it? It's almost
it does. And at the same time, I often ask people, I say, if you contracted a terrible infectious disease that required you to be isolated on a desert island by yourself for 10 years. And that, let's say they took you out there in a cargo plane, and there was room on the cargo plane for all the food and water and medical supplies you need for 10 years. But there was an extra room in the cargo plane where you could take a DVD player, and you were limited to 1,000 DVDs. And I asked people, would you choose all comedies? Nobody ever says they would. And I said, well, would you choose some tragedies too? And they said, well, sure. Then I said, well, on that desert island, when you were watching the tragedy, would you be crying? And they say, well, sure. And because, you know, crying is part of the experience of watching a tragedy. So, you know, what I'm getting at here is assuming, or if there is a framework of existence that, you know, kind of enfolds this one in it, you know, that this is just a little corollary of a bigger picture, then, you know, paradoxically, you would choose some of the lives to be, just because it's learning.
It's balance as well, isn't it? If you were happy all the time, you wouldn't know what happiness was.
Exactly. So, wow. I think that it's something like that. It's as close as I can get to.
I like that. I like that a lot. Thank you so much, Raymond. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Well, me too. This is just delightful. I'm looking forward to meeting you in October too.
Me as well. I look forward to meeting you properly face to face. And you have a lovely, lovely afternoon. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.